Hi, welcome to our third podcast. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this is all about Agatha. In today's episode, we are tackling Agatha Christie's second book, The Secret Adversary, which sees the introduction of Tommy and Tuppence.
Woohoo! Love Tommy and Tuppence.
Yeah. First published in the UK in January 1922 by Christie's UK publisher, The Bodley Head. It was later published in the US the same year. And just to get things very quickly out of the way, synopsis-wise, Kemper is going to do, ideally under 2 minutes, a little bit of a rundown of the bare bones of Christie's plot.
All right, here goes. Childhood friends Tommy Beresford and Prudence, a.k.a. Tuppence Cowley, meet by accident in London soon after the Great War. They go to a tea shop, remarking on the scraps of conversation you often overhear in such places. Tommy mentions hearing the odd name Jane Finn the other day. After tea, Tuppence is stopped by a rather creepy man named Whittington who offers her £100 to go to Paris. Things get weirder when he asks her name and she says the first one that pops into her head, Jane Finn. He turns nasty, asks if Rita has been blabbing, and ends the interview abruptly. Tuppence shares her adventure with Tommy, and together they put an ad in the newspaper requesting information about Jane Finn. They get 2 responses. One from a British intelligence officer who explains Jane Finn was traveling on the doomed Lusitania in 1915 and slipped a packet for safekeeping due to the women and children first rule. But she's since disappeared. The packet contained a draft treaty obviously now defunct, but which would still be politically explosive if revealed. The devious criminal mastermind behind this plot is known simply as Mr. Brown. The intelligence officer invites them to continue searching for Jane Finn, now on behalf of their country. They bravely agree. The second response to the ad is from Julius P. Hersheimer, a wealthy American and cousin to the elusive Jane Finn. Tommy and Tuppence agree to work with him to find her, using the name Rita to locate the high-class criminal Rita Vandermeyer. While in the lobby of Rita's building, they happen to see Whittington. At this point, the action splits in 2. Tommy follows Whittington to a criminal safe house where he gets hit on the head and imprisoned for days, only to escape with the aid of a young Frenchwoman named Annette. Tuppence gets a job as Rita's maid, where she crosses paths with the illustrious and kindly-seeming MP, Sir James Peel Edgerton, eventually confiding the whole affair to him. Tommy and Tuppence flip positions after Tommy's return from captivity, as Tuppence is lured by a telegram to yet another criminal safe house where she's held captive along with Annette. Eventually, Tommy and Julius get the 2 women out and reveal that not only is Annette the long-lost Jane Finn, but Mr. Brown is in fact the illustrious Sir James. Alas, Sir James manages to swallow cyanide from a special ring whilst reciting Latin, but in the end the treaty is destroyed, the labor revolt foiled, and 2 marriages successfully proposed. Jane and Julius, and of course, Tommy and Tuppence. Just under the wire by a second. I was timing myself.
I would like to note just how hard that was a synopsis to actually create, because let's be honest, this is not exactly the smoothest plot to narrate. And while I think we'd normally go straight into a dissection of the mystery puzzle like we did for The Mysterious Affair at Styles, what I think we need to start with here, and I think you'll agree with me, Kemper, is that we need to discuss the fact that this is not actually a puzzle mystery at all. It's a thriller, quote unquote, or a type of a spy novel, a format that really, really sprung into popularity during the First World War with people like John Buchanan, and using it, with her own particularly Christie-esque twist, but that also means it's not structured like a Poirot or a Marple book.
Yeah, I was actually surprised that with Christie's second book, she pivoted from the traditional whodunit to more of these thrillers. I, of course, had always sort of remembered that she wrote these kind of books, but I didn't realize that she turned to them so quickly. And we actually can learn from her own autobiography that she wrote The Secret Adversary pretty much to take a break from the complicated mystery puzzle that had been The Mysterious Affair at Styles. She said that this would be a spy book, a thriller, not a detective story. I liked the idea. It was a change after the detective work involved in The Mysterious Affair at Styles. So I started writing in a sketchy kind of way. It was fun on the whole and much easier to write than a detective story, as thrillers are. And we definitely, I think, can get that sense of fun in this book and in a lot of the thrillers that she writes. She claims that the idea for the book actually was lifted straight from her own life. She was in a tea shop, just like Tommy and Tuppence were, and she overheard the name Jane Fish, which is even weird. Yeah. even weirder than Jane Finn, what she changed it into, which is, at least a little bit more melodious sounding. And she kind of just went from there and just rolled with it, for better or worse. And we'll be discussing both the better and the worse of it. I did just think it was interesting to note that her publisher, John Lane at the Bodley Head in the UK, he did not want to publish The Secret Adversary. She had agreed to a 5-book deal when she got the book deal for Styles. This was the second book that she handed in, and obviously it's very different because it is a thriller, not a detective story. But they did eventually accept it, and it did fine. It did about as well as Styles, not really making her a lot in royalties at first. She got a little bit of money for the serialization rights, but by this time in her career, when The Secret Adversary came out, she talks about how she felt encouraged, but still didn't feel like this was necessarily a long-term career that was going to sustain itself.
I wonder what she got paid in comparison to some of her male peers writing in the same publication, especially here in a genre which, not only then would have been dominated by men, but which is historically to this day a genre
dominated by men. Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. It's funny. Even if she were writing now, she would still be a bit of an outlier, especially within, I would imagine, the spy subgenre. But certainly then she had to be one of the few women who was doing that.
I'm not even sure that I could name another one.
I do want to get into a little bit of the clues and puzzling that Christie does manage to lay down here. This is not going to be in any way nearly as detailed or complicated as it is in Styles, because again, this just is not as complicated of a book. But we do have certain clues and certain deductions that are to be made by the astute reader, just to highlight the ones that at least came out for me as I was reading. The first is that we're given this really big clue when Tuppence is acting as Rita Vandemeyer's maid. This is the rather cruel yet gorgeous high-class criminal, Rita Vandemeyer. Tuppence is trying to keep Rita from leaving her flat in a hurry, and she's in the middle of bribing her for information, essentially, when Rita says, I'm one of the few people that has actually seen this mysterious, enigmatic Mr. Brown in the flesh. And at this point, Rita looks up and she sees Julius Hersheimer and Sir James come in through the door, and she essentially goes into a dead faint, has a heart attack. So what that basically means is one of those two guys has to be Mr. Brown. She's talking about how she knows what Mr. Brown looks like. She looks up, she sees these two men. Pretty clear that one of these two men has to be Mr. Brown. And this happens fairly early on in the book, and like many of Christie's clues, if you pick up on the clue, it really helps structure things and streamline things as the story continues, because those two men are the main suspects.
The book, despite its many convolutions, there are only really possibly 3 suspects, right? Because it could be Julius, it could be Sir James, or I suppose it could be Mr. Carter if you were really feeling like it was an inside job. So basically, we're winnowing down characters in this much, much faster than something like Mysterious Affair of Styles. Yeah,
it's true. There are fewer characters, and finding out the identity of Mr. Brown essentially functions in the same way as finding out the identity of a murderer. Rita actually does end up being murdered by the end of that sequence. So this is technically a murder mystery, as most of her thrillers, her spy novels, do involve at least one murder in the course of the adventure. So they all technically still fall under the category of murder mysteries. But again, they are definitely functioning a little bit differently. Finding out who the mastermind is similar to finding out who the murderer is, but it's not as all-consuming to the story as finding the murderer is in whodunit. But I'll be honest with you, when I was rereading The Secret Adversary this week, I didn't remember the plot of it all that well. And when I got to this point in the story, I was like, okay, so it's either Julius or Sir James. And I was convinced until the very end of the book that it was Julius. Because she really is putting... She's putting out a lot of clues that are supposed to be making us suspicious of Julius. And once I made the decision that it was him, I was just convinced that it was him. And I was genuinely surprised by the ending of this, even though I have read it many years ago. So Well done, Agatha Christie.
Well played, Dame Agatha.
There is one clue that does absolutely point to Sir James as opposed to Julius, and I missed it. We have, toward the end of the book, a letter. Again, always, whenever there's a letter in Agatha Christie, it's super important. It purports to be a letter from Tuppence to Tommy, and this is the point at which Tuppence is essentially being held in captivity in criminal safe house number 2 in Kent, and Tommy is trying to get her out. And the letter says, they know that you're watching, they're moving us. If you get this letter, it means that we're on our way to Wales. And she signs the letter Tuppence, but it's spelled Twopence, which is, of course, Tuppence is an abbreviation for 2 pence. I don't give tuppence, whatever. So that's not a technically incorrect spelling of her name, but it's obviously not the way that Tuppence spells her own name. And we were told, or shown actually, that Tuppence had given Julius a written note, because that was the point at which Julius proposed marriage. And at the end of it, Tuppence sends a very nice note to Julius saying, this isn't going to work out, and signs it with her name. So Julius wouldn't have made that mistake. And again, since we essentially only have 2 people it could possibly have been due to the Rita clue, at that point, 50 pages from the end, a reader smarter than I would know that it has to be Sir James. So that's a clue. Those are really the big ones. There's a little bit of funny business with Rita Vandermeyer. Her full name is Marguerite. We ultimately find out that the hiding place for this all-important treaty is behind a painting of Margaret, the heroine of the opera Faust, whose name is Marguerite. And Annette essentially gives a clue to Tommy and the reader when she says, "I want to go to Marguerite, And Tommy thinks that she means she wants to go back to Rita. Maybe she actually is with these criminals. At that point, he's not really sure. But what she's really doing is giving a clue as to where these papers are. This name Marguerite having a double meaning is very much a Christie move. And then the final clue that I'll go over, there really are only 4 clues, at least I could find, that I thought were worth mentioning, is there's this bit of confusion when Tuppence gets she gets a telegram that purports to be from Tommy, and this is what lures her to criminal safe house number 2. The page boy at the hotel at the Ritz tells Tommy when he's trying to find Tuppence that Tuppence went to Charing Cross Station. But based on the wadded up telegram that Tommy finds in Tuppence's room, which says, "Come to Yorkshire," he realizes that she would have had to go to King's Cross Station. Hopefully not platform 9 3/4. But how can you not mention platform 9 3/4?
That would be way more exciting.
That's true. Actually, hopefully it was platform 9 3/4.
That would be a thrilling twist for Tyler.
So he assumes that the page boy just got it wrong, and that she actually went to King's Cross, not to Charing Cross. But the page boy was right, because the telegram had actually been doctored by the ingenious Mr. Brown. And that's such a Christie clue, because it's sort of like, don't underestimate the help.
Don't ever underestimate the help.
Yeah, don't ever underestimate the help. So that's very much a Christie clue. So, those are 4 solid, clever clue deduction scenarios that are very Christie and exist within this book. But, comparing that to Styles, there were like 15 to 20 of those clues and deduction scenarios in that book. And here we only have 4.
There are very few moving pieces in this.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, despite the convolutions of the plot, again, it's actually, you could pull out most of what she's writing, and it would still probably function as a book. Whereas in something like The Mysterious Affair at Styles, if you pull out any of those elements, then it's sort of like a Jenga tower, right? And a lot of the plot pieces crumble. And here, that's not going to happen.
Totally. Beyond even just the plain linearity of the book. So my biggest criticism on it is that it rests way, way too much on coincidences. We were talking about this a little bit before, Catherine, and you had a good point about coincidence in the spy novel in general. And I don't want to be overly critical of Christie here. So I'm curious what you have to say about that.
You can be overly critical of her, but I do think that she's operating on some spy conventions And if you think about even how they're structured to begin with, most of them, unless it's Jean Le Carré, which is basically about government structure more than it is freewheeling adventure, a lot of the spy novels predicated on a coincidence. I went on a little bit of an Eric Ambler kick a year or two ago, who was probably England's most popular spy novelist in like the late 30s. And his most famous book is this book called A Coffin for Demetrios. And it's totally about like a writer who's like underemployed, working in Turkey, who just like stumbles across some stuff like in a hotel and then like meets like a shady investigator and then just gets to be super nosy Nelly until he's completely involved in like international intrigue. And
so he's just like in the right place at the right time over and over and over again, or gets lucky with finding little things.
You know, if you're going to have an outsider in a spy novel, by default, it kind of has to operate on coincidence.
My problem with it is that it's not just one coincidence. It's not just two coincidences. It's three or four coincidences, and they're really big ones. I mean, the first one, obviously, is that Tommy happens to overhear this name, Jane Finn. Then this guy who's in the tea shop where they're talking accosts Tuppence, has her come to his office. And what we find out later is that what he's asking her to do is impersonate Jane Finn by coincidence, so that when Tuppence happens to say the first name that pops into her head, Jane Finn, he thinks that she's onto him and knows exactly what's going on, and that's obviously what sets them on the whole adventure. So that's one major coincidence that, to my mind, is even more egregious than happening to be in the right place at the right time. And in fact, the second coincidence is happening to be in the right place at the right time. This is when Tommy and Tuppence finally find Rita Vandermeyer. Mr. Whittington, the guy who invited Tuppence to her office, mentions Rita. They search through the Lusitania passenger lists and eventually find Rita, and it's believable the way that they do that. She actually spends quite a few pages on that search. But when they happen to go to her building, Whittington, that man, is coming out. So that's a very much right place, right time thing. Tommy then goes and follows Whittington and is kind of launched on his adventure. The third one, which is, I think, a very needless coincidence, is that when Tommy, having followed Mr. Whittington to this criminal safe house, goes up to the door, the man at the door asks him essentially for the password, because of course there's a password at a safe house in a book like this. He just says Mr. Brown, because that's the first thing that pops into his head. And lo and behold, that happens to be the right thing. And we'll get to this when we go to the adaptations, but there are two different adaptations for this novel. And full disclosure, I watched one and Catherine watched the other, because we did not both have time to watch 2 3-hour. Well, mine was 2 hours. Yours was 3 hours, right, Catherine?
Definitely 3 hours. Absolutely 3 hours.
We did not have time to watch 5 hours of The Secret Adversary, so we split it up. Mine was extremely faithful, but one of the few deviations that they did was that in this moment with the Mr. Brown password, Tommy overhears Mr. Whittington say the password, and then he says it, which is like such a good fix. And then the last one is that Tuppence just happens to walk back to Rita Vandermeyer's flat at the moment at which Rita is trying to flee, and Albert sees her. She's not supposed to be back yet, but Albert, who is the boy that works in the lobby of the building, he sees her and he tips her off. So that again was incredibly convenient. Thank you. And the thing is, and here's also why, and I'm gonna quote from the book for a second, because here's what actually annoyed me the most about this coincidence thing. Christie was obviously aware of this, that she was relying a lot on coincidences. So she did a thing that in the writerly world is called hanging a lantern on it. What that basically means is that if you're doing something that you know is a little,
I think cliche might also.
Yeah. If you're doing something cliched or that is hard to believe or requires a major suspension of disbelief, often a writerly trick is to just actually highlight it within the story itself and bring attention to it. Hang a lantern on it.
Suspicion all of the time, right? It's I think even more so than in in the literary world, you see it happen in episodic television. Also because it's a little bit like a shortcut. You don't have to justify yourself.
You just highlight. I think it is probably a TV writing term, actually.
Yeah,
so Tuppence says, I've often noticed that once coincidences start happening, they go on happening in the most extraordinary way. I dare say it's some natural law that we haven't found out. I dare say it's not, actually. I don't really think that that's true.
I completely agree with you, although I was thinking about this very same thing, in that it actually is apparently some kind of like weird psychological thing that if you fixate on something, you start seeing it everywhere. So there is a little bit of justification to that idea that once you see a coincidence,
right,
you start seeing the pattern over and over again.
There's a little bit.
I don't think her point is. I don't think Tuppence's point is unjustified. I think the level of coincidence is unjustified within this novel, but I don't necessarily think that is a completely invalid point on Tuppence's part.
Right. So let's move on from the coincidences and the plotting of the story and just talk a little bit about Tommy and Tuppence as a detective pair who only feature in 4 novels and 1 short story collection. So they're very sporadic, but they actually span her entire career. The Secret Adversary is her 2nd novel, and Postern of Fate, which we will get to many, many moons from now, is, while not the last published novel, it is actually the last novel that she wrote. I think it's actually very interesting what Christie's inspiration was for Tommy and Tuppence, which she talks about in her autobiography, because it's actually a little bit similar to her inspiration, in a way, to her inspiration for Poirot. She says, it was desperate young people who had come out of the services and had no jobs to go to. Young men were always ringing our doorbell, trying to sell stockings or offering some household gadget. It was a pathetic sight. One felt so sorry for them that one often bought a pair of rather nasty stockings just to cheer them up. They had been lieutenants, naval and military, and now they were reduced to this. Sometimes they even wrote poems and tried to sell them. It's interesting.
That last is the most breaking.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. I mean, the idea of like these former naval officers writing poems and trying to sell them door to door is that's like some Willy Loman, just like heartbreaking.
It's more depressing than Willy Loman. I'm just imagining these young men in the trenches in Belgium writing these poems in a journal and then having to go to like housewives.
Yeah.
Like trying to like garner up sympathy to buy them. What a depressing thought.
It's just interesting to me that these 2 detectives came out of an underclass of people in the same way that Hercule Poirot actually did. Poirot was among these refugees, Belgian refugees from war, and Tommy and Tuppence are among these penniless young servicemen and servicewomen with nowhere to go, no work to be had. But in the same way, for both of them, the individuals are very much the exception to their greater class. And I think that's also such a kind of Christie trope, where Poirot certainly is no refugee to feel sorry for. He's whip smart. He's meticulous about his clothes. He does not invite anyone's pity in any way. Tommy and Tuppence, when the novel opens, are absolutely hard up. They're broke, but you never once feel sorry for them. They have this pluck and this spirit, and they clearly are not wallowing in any sort of misery. And
well, I mean, she likes self-starters, right? These are people who are curious about everything.
They're not people who are using their connections to get ahead. They're people who are using their native intelligence and their go-get-em attitude and their positivity. This was very much the way that Agatha Christie viewed herself. I think she thought of herself as someone who wasn't particularly well-connected and who came from a middle-class background and a family that, was certainly not poor, but didn't always have a lot of money, and she made do with what she had. By some accounts, she, one of the reasons that she even decided to write the second book was that her husband, Archie Christie, encouraged her to, because he said, if you got paid a little bit on the first book, maybe you'll get paid more on the second book. And she could use the money to help her mother keep their old childhood home, Ashfield, which Agatha Christie loved. So she was very much about doing what she needed to do and being a self-starter. And I actually kind of think that Agatha Christie saw herself in much the way that she presents Tuppence in this book, and a lot of the younger heroines in these thriller spy novels that we're going to be reading shortly in the 20s. And these women are all plucky, quick-witted, curious, loyal, outwardly unsentimental, yet inwardly extremely sentimental, with an unfailing sense of humor and a huge appetite. And I mean that both literally for food and figuratively for life. Down to little details like Tuppence loves creamy cakes, which I promise you, Agatha Christie talks a lot about creamy cakes in her autobiography. She's a big fan of she's a big fan of cream. Well, she's from Devonshire, so there's the whole Devonshire cream thing. So she's really into it.
Creamy cake. I feel like I would have seen this on the many, many seasons of Great British Bake Off that I've watched. And then I do not remember Mary Berry ever mentioning a creamy cake as like a subgenre of the British baked good.
All right. This is a little ridiculous, but I've already been such a nerd on this podcast, and I'm going to continue to do it. But in The Secret Adversary, Agatha Christie talks about this green toque, which is a kind of hat. It's like a little 20s hat that Tuppence wears, and it's actually the hat that washes up on the Yorkshire coast when Tommy thinks that Tuppence is dead. And Agatha Christie, in her autobiography, she highlights this outfit that she had made for her when she was still young, when she was about 19, which is around the age that Tuppence is in this novel. And she says that it was this outfit that she wore for at least 6 years. The coat was long and had a velvet collar. With it, I wore a smart little toque in greenish-brown shades of velvet and a bird's wing. I have no photographs of myself in this getup. If I had, I should no doubt think I looked highly ridiculous now. But my memories of myself are as looking smart, sporting, and well-dressed. I feel like the toque... I feel like Tuppence's toque is absolutely like the toque Agatha's wearing. And of course it is. I mean, writers always pull things from their own life, but I just think there are a lot of connections between Tuppence and Agatha.
But you know what's also really interesting about that? Prior to the 1960s, probably, investing in something like a nice hat or a nice coat that you could wear even ridiculously for 6 or 7 years, that would be a practical, smart use of their money. And like, if you think like of Tommy and Tuppence as being like super savvy and smart, and about young Agatha being the same, I think it's an interesting parallel.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When Tommy and Tuppence first meet Julius Hersheimer, and he tells them that he met this inspector from Scotland Yard and gave the inspector the one photo in existence that anyone has of Jane Finn. And then as he's telling them this, they receive a card from a Scotland Yard inspector, which is very strange. And of course, the first inspector ends up having been Mr. Brown, and the photo is gone. The second inspector's card is none other than
Inspector Jack.
Yay! Because what that means is that the Christie-verse has room for both Tommy and Tuppence and Poirot. We don't know if Miss Marple is in a parallel universe somewhere in St. Mary Mead, but we do know that Tommy and Tuppence and Poirot and Hastings exist in the same world, and that just makes me very happy. I think we should get to the politics of this book, because the MacGuffin in this book, and of course by MacGuffin I just mean the thing that is motivating the plot, is extremely political, and I think it tends to be political in Christie's spy novels.
Political in all spy novels?
I guess that's true. I think my point is just that it seems like, because I think Christie had such a specific political viewpoint, they all, to me, seem to fall into the same category of traditionalist or conservative-leaning, British-loving, foreign-fearing politics, if that's fair. This one certainly does. We should evaluate them as we read them, but this one, to me, certainly fell into that category.
Oh, I mean, I think that is absolutely true. I just, I don't I don't necessarily think she's doing anything particularly differently than what most other spy writers do. Because if you think about, so Tommy and Tuppence basically take on this case to benefit, their country, right? They're saving their country from the evils of the Bolsheviks.
Well, sort of. I mean, that's the thing. Let's back up for a second, because I think that's what Christie wants us to believe, that what's at stake here is the very country itself. But I'd actually like to just go into the text as to the reason why this treaty. So the MacGuffin here, the papers that this Jane Finn was passed on the Lusitania that everyone's trying to find are a treaty that the Allied forces at the time in 1915 agreed to. And supposedly, whatever was said in the course of this treaty, which is obviously obsolete now, would be so explosive in a political way that would actually help out the Labour Party in the UK. And the Labour Party, somewhat unbeknownst to itself, is being funded / influenced by the Bolsheviks in Russia, who, of course, around this time is when the Russian Revolution had happened. So this is sort of peak Red Scare sort of business. And the idea is that this criminal mastermind, Mr. Brown, and all of his criminal associates are helping out the Bolsheviks, who are in turn helping out the Labour Party to foment unrest and start this massive labor strike, because there's so much discontent among people like Tommy and Tuppence, who are out of work after the war, and that what this is going to do is provide such instability that it leads to anarchy and the very downfall of the government. To me, it's like that shows that she thinks that the British government is really pretty weak and doesn't have the ability to absorb a lot of conflict. And
the British government, especially in the wake of World War I, was pretty weak. To be completely honest, there's a certain brand of rancid populism that perhaps some in...
What could you possibly be talking about?
In a certain country that we might be familiar with, foreign entities do historically try to take advantage of moments of populist discord. And I'm not entirely sure that's a completely conservative fear. I think it swings both
ways. I think that's totally fair, and I think I'm being a little bit hard on her, and I'm not being fair because I'm also bringing to bear some of her later books and views that are espoused in those later books. But I think if you take this one on its own merits, it doesn't have as inherently a conservative viewpoint, especially given the time in which it's written. I think that's fair. The one thing that I think is interesting is that this strike that is looming, of course, did eventually actually happen. I mean, there was a massive strike in the middle of the 1920s, the Great Strike of 1926, and it was a big problem. I mean, it didn't bring the government to its knees or anything, but these were obviously real issues that I'm sure Agatha Christie was reading about in the newspaper every day, and may have been more believable or easier to swallow for a contemporary audience. I think that's fair.
Not only that, but if you look at when the spy novel really comes to the fore, it's during the Cold War. They're not the Bolsheviks in Le Carré, but, it's about the East Germans and the Politburo and, the sort of machination of this sort of monolithic communist regime. And that is every spy novel during the Cold War, from Ian Fleming to Le Carré to Tom Clancy, and so really what she's just doing is a very early take on the sort of Red Scare. She's doing a very smart take on a very common trope, or at least one that would become very common. I'd also briefly note that there's a Sherlock Holmes story called The Adventure of the Second Stain. It's from 1904, and it involves a document that has gone missing that the British government cannot find, and it's unclear exactly what it involves, but it could put Europe and England at war, and it's, involves a dangerous foreign entity. And I only bring it up because I think it's funny that Mysterious Script is in a lot of ways fan fiction for A Study in Scarlet, and this, in fact, has, at least a similar setup.
As we know, she was a big Sherlock Holmes fan, so I'm sure she read that. Let's move on to the adaptation for The Secret Adversary. So, The Secret Adversary was made in German and released as Die Abenteuer, a silent movie, in February of 1929. We did not watch that. We did, though, as I mentioned a little earlier, we watched the 2 television adaptations that exist of The Secret Adversary. So in 1983, London Weekend Television did a 2-hour version of this, and it was essentially a prequel to a series called Partners in Crime, which was an adaptation of the Tommy and Tuppence collection of short stories, which we will also be getting to a little bit later. Agatha Christie wrote a ton of short stories in addition to novels, of course, especially earlier on in her career. So she's got lots of Poirot short stories, she's got lots of Tommy and Tuppence short stories, she has other standalone short stories. When she starts doing Miss Marple, she does Miss Marple short stories. We're going to be covering those short stories, interspersing our novels with short stories each week to give ourselves a little bit of breathing room on the reading and the analysis. So we'll absolutely be getting to those. They started off this series with this long adaptation of The Secret Adversary, and it is incredibly faithful to the book. A couple of differences that I thought were interesting for various reasons. These will be quick. In the book, I thought it was funny that Julius Hersheimer, the wealthy American, is the son of not just an oil baron, not just a steel magnate, not just a railroad executive, but all 3. It's like you could tell Agatha Christie was like, I want to make sure that you realize that this Julius character is really, really rich. So it's all of them, which is insane. In the adaptation, Julius's father is just an oil baron. It's enough. Tommy, who's played by James Warwick, is much handsomer than described in the book. He does not have slick back red hair. Tuppence is also rather glamorous. This is not surprising. These changes are always made in adaptations. And I mentioned how they took out one of those coincidences that bothered me in the book. I liked that. Rita Vandermeyer is also much older. She's still glamorous, but she's certainly not as beautiful as described in the book. And the first time she's introduced, Tuppence is just kind of standing there in her interview for a maid, listening to Rita Vandermeyer play the harpsichord. It's bizarre. She's just like a creepy old lady playing the harpsichord. It's a little crypt keepery. So there's that. Honestly, though, otherwise there's a little bit of flattening out of the plot. We don't get the sequence where Sir Julius gets a fake Jane Finn into a hospital bed, and there's like multiple searches for multiple things that Julius and Tommy never find, where they're going up and down the country. Like the plot gets a little loose and baggy, I think, toward the last quarter of the book, and this adaptation tightened that up a little bit. But otherwise it was really very much as is, and makes me excited for watching the series, which we Partners in Crime, with these same actors and the same producers, which we will do when we get to the short story collection. So with that, take it away, Catherine.
So it ended up being 6-episode series. It was not renewed. In 2015, it marked Agatha Christie's 125th birthday. It was released by the BBC. It starred David Williams, who at least American viewers would most know from Little Britain, and Jessica Raine, who American viewers would mostly know from the first few seasons of Called Midwife. And they made the choice to set it in like 1952. So it is set during the Cold War instead of after World War One. Tommy and Tuppence do not start detective agency. They are, in fact, sort of financially middling, suburban dwellers who have a, I guess, teenage son who is in a boarding school. Tommy is trying to start a honey business. And so the inciting incident...
Come again? A honey business?
Yes, correct. Their backyard is filled with beehives.
Okay.
And the inciting incident actually has them coming back from France, where they were, to pick up a very expensive and highly acclaimed queen bee to really give that extra oomph to their apiaries. So, and then they meet Jane on the train coming back, and she leaves a hoarding inside of the container that contains the queen bee. Well, she runs off, and the gentleman she's with is shot on the train. And then she dives out of the window of, I believe, a ladies' room. And that is the incident of the 2015 adaptation.
Wow, so it's just totally different.
It's similar plot, beats in the roughest possible way. One of my biggest issues, or one of the things I found most disappointing about it, is that they didn't have much in the way of chemistry. And part of what's actually one of the more charming elements about the book is that Tommy and Tuppence's banter is actually, charming.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's actually a good segue into our final section in which we rate the book. So let's just get into it. First category, which are plotting mechanics. I do think that the idea behind, this political MacGuffin, the idea of a treaty that's old, that's 5 years old, but would do political harm now due to changes in political circumstances, is a solid idea. There are Marvel movies built on much stupider premises than that. I don't know if that's not actually a good yardstick to use, but I think it's a solid premise. The mechanics of it, the way that the plot proceeds, again, this is a simpler, more linear kind of a plot. We go from point to point. Well, in our second category, which is the credibility of the plotting, that's when we'll get into some of the problems that we raised earlier. But to me, this was the mechanics of the plot are solid, not spectacular, which is why I'm going to rate it a 5 out of 10.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think the mechanics in and of themselves, it's hard to compare against one of her puzzle mysteries.
I do too. I think what we'll learn is that, we are comparing them though, right? Since we're comparing all the novels against each other. And I think this is a category where the mystery puzzles are naturally going to get higher scores because the mechanics are more, they require greater intricacy and complexity. But I think some of the categories to come, i.e. character, and tone and setting, I think are going to tend to be better for these novels because she just has more room. She has more room to actually explore. So do you want to take the credibility of the mystery puzzle, the plot?
The fact that our, dear young missing ingenue is apparently fluent in French enough to be, a native speaker is a little bit concerning.
Yeah, we're told that Americans are further along in things such as knowing French than their British equivalents. But as an American, I feel pretty confident saying it's a little bit of a stretch that a 19-year-old would be able to fool a bunch of criminals, including some who are presumably from France or have spent a lot of time in France or with French people. So
it seems unlikely.
Yeah. There is one thing that I think Christie did very well in terms of the credibility here, which is there's this whole subplot. It's not a subplot, but there's this whole idea that Jane Finn has actually been stricken with amnesia. And that she, because of the shock of the Lusitania, she forgot who she was, and she's either been wasting away in a sanatorium or, acting as this French woman, Annette. And we do learn in the end that that's all been a ruse. That said, there are a couple of things that I think are endemic to the spy novel. But, we have Tommy getting hit on the head in just the right way to pass out but not be killed. We have bullets flying but not flying all over the place but not actually hitting anyone. But the biggest thing, though, again, for me, is the coincidences. And as we were discussing, that also is perhaps something that, a lot of spy novels rely on. But I think this one goes above and beyond in relying too much and too often on coincidences. So I was going to give it a 3 out of 10. I don't know how you feel about that, Catherine.
It's hard because for what it is, I feel like that might be low. But at the same time, those are all valid points. And, we're figuring out this rating system as we go along.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I would go along with that.
You can live with that? Okay.
I can live with that.
Okay, so on to a category where I think Secret Adversary does extremely well, and that is character, specifically of the detectives. So Tommy and Tuppence as characters, this is the first time they're being introduced, so we're going to give them high marks because, again, Agatha Christie is doing the heavy lifting by introducing them, but I think they're delightful. It sounds like Catherine at least somewhat agrees with me. I think that, yes, their banter and their chemistry really jumps off the page in a way that is not necessarily easy to do. This is something that Agatha Christie does that she's not often, I think, given a lot of credit for. Her dialogue works. It works really, really well. And she's often employing it just to get out a lot of information in a sort of effortless and fluid and entertaining way. But here, because there's not as much intricate plotting to do, she really has some breathing room to just allow these two just have fun with each other. And in the beginning, especially of the book, the pages fly by, and a lot of it really has to do with the chemistry between them and just the light, bantering humor, which I really, really loved. Tuppence in particular, we talked a lot about her and potential similarities to Agatha Christie herself. She's a very strong character. We haven't talked as much about Tommy, and I would just say that I love this idea that Tommy is, in his solidity and his almost not stupidity, but his rock solid kind of good guy way actually ends up being the most formidable adversary in the book and the one who ultimately really does take down Mr. Brown. And there's this moment on page 269 in the book where Tuppence almost doubts Tommy's ability to do this. And Agatha Christie writes, "Not that she disbelieved in Tommy, but occasionally she was shaken with doubts as to whether anyone so simple and honest as he was could ever be a match for the fiendish subtlety of the arch criminal." And this is kind of the same idea as, bear with me, Frodo Baggins being the only one who can destroy the ring in The Lord of the Rings. It's this idea of his clear-headedness and his goodness that kind of overcomes. And that's a very classic Agatha Christie trope. So anyway, that ended up being a very long-winded way of saying I think that these are fantastic characters. I really enjoyed them, and I would give them a 9 out of 10.
I think I agree, and also I would note that she has the great benefit in this, not just from the freedom given to her by not having to puzzle out the mystery through expository dialogue, but also because her previous writing attempt was written through the viewpoint of Captain Hastings. So she doesn't have, she has so much more freedom in the third person in this book that she really kind of, lets herself fly a little bit in experimenting with dialogue and with the possibility of the characters.
So now we're on to the next category of non-detective characters. So these are just the characters specific to this book. I think they're certainly better than the characters in Styles.
Yeah, I mean, without any question, or at least fleshed out, and they seem to have some sort of internal thought processes. You have a problem with Julius's dialogue, but I actually think Julius is relatively fleshed out as a character.
Julius is relatively fleshed out as a character, but again, her dialogue, as I just pointed out how good her dialogue can be, but sometimes it can be really bad. And I know I wasn't an American in 1920, but I don't think anyone ever spoke like this. Just a really quick example. This is Julius the American speaking. "See here," he declared. "This isn't Sicily. No demanding ransom or threatening to crop her ears if I refuse. These are the British Isles, so quit the funny business, or I'll just sing out for that beautiful big British policeman I see out there in Piccadilly." It's just, there's so much idiom overusage anytime he speaks as an American. It makes me cringe. So what would you give this one?
I mean, I think you said 5, and that seems reasonable.
All right, 5 out of 10 for characters other than the detectives. So then we get to setting and tone. And the setting and tone here is great. And I think, again, because she had some room to breathe, I think Agatha Christie was able to give us some details that really do help evoke the world in which Tommy and Tuppence live. And then there's also this great little line at the very end of the book where Tuppence, they have this big dinner to honor Tuppence and Tommy and Jane and Julius. And Tuppence's father, who's an archdeacon, is at the dinner, and she's on her best behavior. And Christie writes that she forbore to cross her legs, set a guard upon her tongue, and steadfastly refused to smoke. I love the idea that at that time, a lady crossing her legs was considered indecorous, as was smoking. And then we mentioned that there's a lot of banter and humor, and one very quick example of that in the beginning between Tommy and Tuppence is when Tuppence gets that first 50 pounds from Whittington at that interview. You know, they've had no money. They've been basically broke. And she runs to Tommy and shows him the money. And they're standing in the middle of the street. And they say, I think it's Tommy that says this, there's a huge bus bearing down on us. It would be too terrible if they killed the 5-pound notes. And later, Agatha Christie's narrator writes, you know, that they have this, that they spent the day with this money, and the day passed pleasantly, the evening even more so. 2 of the 5-pound notes were now irretrievably dead. And there's just this the playfulness to it is just really, really delightful. And also, you know, we've kind of alluded to this, but the actions of this adventure plot, of this spy plot, they're hijinks and they're fun. Tommy spends this extended sequence where he's inching a doorknob open. He's twisting the doorknob bit by bit to try to, you know, keep all the criminal masterminds that are sitting in a room from seeing that he's doing it. And it's very tense. And he snoops in the safe house before he gets hit over the head. And Tuppence is creeping around on the balcony in Rita Vandermeyer's apartment. And Julius Hersheimer climbs a tree outside a sanitarium and, of course, falls from it and injures his leg. These are all just fun, kind of ridiculous, cartoony, but in a good way, hijinks that they're doing. So I really enjoyed that. I would give this an 8 out of 10 for setting and tone.
Tone, I'm with you on that. Setting, I feel like less of a sense of place, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
So I would probably not give that an 8, but, you know, tone-wise, I'm certainly happy to rate it that high, I think.
Yeah, I think it's the mixture. I think I agree with you. I think setting is certainly not as evocative as tone in this. I think the tone is really good. So I think as a whole, it's an 8 out of 10. Okay, so final category, which is, of course, our deductions for however much the book may have been stuck in the time in which it was written. And I honestly think this book does pretty well in this category. Tommy and Tuppence are very much on equal terms as a detective pair, which Curran actually in the introduction to this book notes is quite unusual. Nick and Nora Charles of Thin Man fame, there's actually only one novel of the Thin Man ever written, and then a whole bunch of William Powell Myrna Loy movies, of course. Their most famous example of a married detective pair, but there aren't many of them, and I think you can see it in this book from the get-go. There are lots of passages in which Tuppence asserts her independence, if not dominance, over Tommy. It's interesting that from the get-go, this is a joint venture.
Yes, absolutely.
Of the two of them.
Yeah, and I agree that she is, I think, the more dominant one.
Yeah.
Which, and she's sassy.
She's totally sassy. And even though we didn't quite believe in her linguistic powers, Jane Finn, a.k.a. the enigmatic French woman Annette, she's remarkably brave. She's resourceful. She gets captured by spies, and she spends 5 years pretending not to know who she is, and she succeeds in her goal, and that's cool. So I think in terms of gender parody, the book actually does remarkably well. There's, a bit of a xenophobia issue, which is not surprising given also the political nature of the book. There are a couple of passages that go a little far. The criminal mastermind meeting in which we see also, Germans and Irish and Russians feels a little bit like, oh, look at all these scary foreigners. There's also one sequence where the Bolshevist Kremenin is reclining on a couch and dictating to his secretary in, quote, sibilant Russian, end quote, which seemed a little cartoony to me. But honestly, I don't think that the stuck in its time-ness of this book is all that bad. I would say out of a possible 10 points to deduct, I would deduct 3, maybe even 2, now that I'm thinking about it.
I might even go with 2 because I don't think, well, I mean, I don't know how low the bar is. I don't think it's in any way worse than any of the Cold War era books of similar theme.
Yeah.
So
let's deduct 2.
No, I mean, yeah.
Okay, so that's our ranking, which is out of a possible 50 points, 10 out of 10 for the first 5 categories. We have 5 plus 3 plus 9 plus 5 plus 8, which is 30 minus 2-point deduction for 28. So The Secret Adversary is officially our top-ranked Agatha Christie novel among 2. First place, Secret Adversary. Second place, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. So feel free to contact us with differing opinions about our ranking, especially as our ranking system grows. We would love to hear from you. We'd also appreciate if you could read and review us either on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you ingest or imbibe your podcasts. You can reach us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com or on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can reach me, Kemper, at Kemper Donovan. You can reach Catherine at Broadcat. And you can also see us on Instagram at allaboutthedame. Thank you, as always, to the wonderful Josh Blaker for our continually lovely logo. And programming note, so for next week we are going to do our first short story as opposed to a full novel, and we are going to start with the first Christie short story published, which is a Poirot.
We'll be discussing The Adventure of the Western Star, and we will also be discussing, of course, the Suchet adaptation.
Join us. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.